Can I have your attention, please? It's a little after 6. We'd like to get started. We're here tonight to talk about power cost in general and where we are today and where we'll be going in the future with the best of our information and knowledge. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Paul Beckhusen here from AMP. People often wonder, who is AMP? Well, AMP is, I consider them to be our power supply partner. And we work with them very closely to establish our power supply issues and where we get power from. And they advise us regularly about market conditions. So without further ado, I'd like to have Paul Beckhusen come up here and start his presentation. He'll be talking about the power market. And we're not really equipped here to take questions about individual bills. I don't have that information. If you have questions about your bill, you need to talk to the finance department and the folks downstairs in Treasury. They'll be happy to help you and talk with you. So, okay, here's Mr. Paul Beckhusen. I hope we can be respectful and learn something tonight. I appreciate everybody coming out.
Thanks, John, and appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. Again, my name is Paul Beckhusen. I am the Senior Vice President of Power Supply and Generation Operations for American Municipal Power. So I've got some information here. First part will be about what American Municipal Power, who we are. And I'll use the acronym AMP. And then talk some specifics about energy markets and what drives wholesale prices, which then relate to the retail rates that residential, industrial, and commercial customers pay. And then talk just in general about power supply and the resources that the town has and the benefits that it provides. And I apologize if I turn my back here once in a while to look at the screen or point something out, but American Municipal Power, we're what is referred to as a joint action agency. We were formed in 1971 and predominantly around being able to aggregate the needs of municipal electric systems like Bedford for power supply. So today we have over 130 members in 9 states. And you can see the states listed there. Bedford became a member of AMP in 2006, so 20 years ago. And it was power supply that drove that membership to AMP at the time. We own and operate projects for our members. We serve, you can see there, over 665,000 meters, or nearly 3.5 megawatts. I'll try my best to not use too much lingo in the power supply business, where I'll try to explain it, what that is, what it means. We have a diverse generation portfolio, which I'll spend a lot of time talking about. It includes hydro, coal, natural gas, solar, wind, and diesel. We're governed by 22-member board. So again, we're owned by Municipal Electrics. We don't have shareholders. We are a tax-exempt entity. I'll talk a little bit about the structure there. We have 235 employees. You can see our assets and revenues. I'll jump to the next slide. Here's just a map geographically showing where our members are. So you can see the Virginia area here. We've got Front Royal, Bedford, Danville, Martinsville, and Richlands are our Virginia members. The value proposition that we provide our members is proven experience in economics of scale for generation projects, purchase power, transmission. These are all things that impact wholesale power costs. And I'll spend more time with some upcoming slides. We negotiate, coordinate power supply options on behalf of the members. We operate a 24/7, 365-day year energy control center where we dispatch our resources and schedule members' power supplies in the markets. We do a lot of advocacy on behalf of our members. I'll spend some more time on that here in a minute, particularly on local, state, federal issues. And we offer a wide variety of other services outside of power supply, which I'll just touch on here briefly in a second. So again, we are a joint action agency. So again, we go in, we identify what our members' needs, we aggregate those up, and we come up with the best economic options. And again, that can be power supply, other types of services. We have a deep bench and a breadth of experience in the industry, which the members have access to. We provide mutual aid, coordinate mutual aid, so in the event, if there's a storm that impacts a community, we coordinate mutual aid to have other members come into the community and help get power restored. And a number of other things. The energy market, particularly the power industry, is very dynamic, so we've got a number of things around safety and training that we manage on behalf of our members. Just the growth story of the organization, you can see in 2000, so prior to Bedford's membership, we had 82 members in 3 states. We had a lot of growth through the 2010 to recent, and a lot of asset development and other financial information that you can see there. I'm going to spend much time on these. These are for reference for folks at their leisure, but from a governance standpoint, as I mentioned, we have a 22-member board, and these board seats are representative of the membership. Bedford, via John Wagner, represents Virginia on the AMP board, so John is one of our AMP board members. On the project development side of things, again, we look at all of our members' needs, we aggregate those needs, and we look at long-term power supply options. Those can include assets that we build and own and operate, or they can be what's referred to as power purchase agreements, or these are contracts to purchase wholesale power. We do these evaluations, we make the recommendations to the members, in this case, the town of Bedford. And then members conduct their similar analysis based on our recommendations, and ultimately if they choose to participate in the project, then they move forward with authorizing resolutions to do that. So at the end of the day, any power supply agreements or projects that we partake or we develop, the members approve those prior to us doing that. A couple of projects we currently have under development, just as a point of reference, we've got a solar resource that we are currently in the process of what we call subscribing, so going to the members with recommendations and having them authorize it if they'd like to participate, and then also a natural gas combined cycle plant, and both of those are coming up on May 1 end date here, where we'll be closing those projects out. And then we're also developing what's referred to as a behind-the-meter peaking generation project. This is where we own and install generation within the member communities to hedge reduced capacity and transmission costs, which I'll spend some more time here talking about that and the impact that has on wholesale rates. So on the power supply and generation front, as I mentioned, we do this power supply planning on behalf of all the members. We meet at least once a year with each member, if not more, depending on what their portfolio looks like or what the needs of the community may be. We manage peak shaving and demand response, and I'll again talk about that. Those are programs to help reduce transmission capacity costs, which have increased significantly in wholesale power costs over the last couple of years. And then we have the Energy Control Center that I mentioned as well, that we operate 365 days a year. And a couple pictures here of two of our assets. The top one is the Fremont Energy Center. That's the natural gas combined cycle plant, and the one below that is one of the run-of-the-river hydro plants that we own and operate. Here's just a list of the different assets that we own on the top. And then below that, under the PPA heading there, those are contracts that we have. And this pie chart kind of summarizes it from a resource standpoint and what that looks like. So from going clockwise from the top, the first section of the portfolio there is Prairie State, labeled Prairie State. That's a coal plant. It's a what's referred to as a mine mouth coal plant. So the coal is on the property, it's mined, and it goes right to the plant. So it's very economical resource. The fuel cost is consistent because the coal is part of the project. We own it. Then we have wind and solar. We still have a few members that own their own coal plants, so that's that next slice. And then the portion after that are the hydro assets that we own and operate, along with some other contractual hydro resources that our members have that come from federal hydro facilities. And then the Fremont Energy Center, that's the gas plant I mentioned earlier, the small slice of landfill gas, so those are generators that operate off of gas from methane gas from landfills. And then a little over a third is purchase power, and that can be contracts, long-term, medium-term, monthly, so there's a large variety of different contracts that fall into that purchase power. Just again, programs and services, I won't spend a lot of time here tonight on this, highlighting a couple of them that drive a lot of value for our members, and this is the safety training that we provide our members, and then the mutual aid program that I mentioned earlier. Again, just more of those services. And then we have some at-cost subscription programs for members. These are programs that members can participate in, and there's a cost associated with that. So. And just as a reference point, this picture here is the Bedford Electric Department with a training session that was done here in Bedford a few years ago, back in 25, I guess, a year ago. On the advocacy front, as I mentioned, we have full-time staff at the federal, regional transmission organizations, RTOs, which I'll talk about here in a second, and then the state level. And we do this all on behalf of our members to, this type of advocacy would be difficult for any individual member to do on their own. Having the consultants or the lobbying that needs to be done, we can be very effective at it with when we look at it with all of our members in mind. And then just another company that we have outside of the power supply is AMP Transmission. About 6 years ago, we started this company, and it's focused on the transmission side of the power supply business, and this was done as an opportunity for members to hedge their costs related to, and the organization as a whole, related to transmission cost. And then just the last thing, our mission, vision, and values. I won't here. It's something we take pride in. Our members are part of this process that set these goals for the organization, and we drive to meet these every day as staff. So I'm going to talk about wholesale energy markets, and then I'll try to not get too technical. So when you talk about wholesale power supply, there are three components to it. The energy charge, which is measured in kilowatt hours. You'll hear me use megawatt hours, so typically at the retail level, what residential customers see in their bill is based on kilowatt hours. On the wholesale side, we typically use use. Talk about megawatts. But this is the energy. So this is the energy that flows 365 days a year, 24 hours a day to meet the needs. And then there's transmission charge. So this is the charge related to the high voltage transmission system to deliver the power. So if you think about the transmission system, it's like the highway system. Okay, so you've got these power plants that are typically located out in areas that aren't near the population centers or load centers. You need to get that power there. That gets delivered by the high voltage transmission system. And then you have the capacity charge, which ensures that there is enough generation in place, so power supply generation in place to meet the reliability requirements to keep the lights on, if you will. So when we talk about these charges here in a minute, I'll differentiate these a little bit. On the transmission charge, that is the highest single 1 hour peak demand of the system, in this case Bedford's load, at the time that the AEP system peaks. So I'll show you a map here that'll put some context around that. But that's the highest peak hour in the year, okay? And then there's a price associated with that, so that peak demand times that price is what the transmission charge is. That can happen anytime. So it can happen in the winter, it can happen in the summer. This part of the country, it's about 50-50 because of the electric heat, and when there's a cold winter, we typically will see this part of the country peak in the wintertime. This past year was a perfect example with the winter storm Fern and the cold weather that was seen in January. Most likely that set this one transmission peak for this, not this current year, but the 2027 planning year. And then the capacity charge is based on the 5 highest coincident peaks of the system, in this case Bedford system, at the time that PJM, and again I'll show you a map here again, but they're the regional transmission organization, their 5 highest peaks during the summer months, June 1st through September 30th. So fundamentally, when you think about wholesale energy prices in the market, it's basic supply and demand. So when there's undersupply, not enough to meet the demand, drives the price up, right? We're all seeing that at the gas pumps right now, right, with some of the political issues that are going on in the world. In the case where supply exceeds the demand, well, that drives the price down. So at that point of crossing, that's the price that you pay, if you will, for whatever it may be. In this case, we're here to talk about wholesale power supply, but it can be really any commodity. So what's happened, and I'll show some supporting information here, is this supply-demand curve has shifted where we're seeing the supply or the demand increase, load. At the same time, our generation supply has, particularly around baseload resources, so resources that run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, those have decreased. So we're at an inflection point where demand is outpacing supply, which in turn, based on fundamental energy, demand supply curve, causes price to go up. So this is just a historical look. So off to your left, 2000, so we're going back 25 years. You can see this is a correlation between the red line is natural gas prices. So the energy market, wholesale energy market, is predominantly driven by the cost of natural gas. And I'll show that in a second with, there's a large amount of natural gas generation. So with that correlation, power prices tend to follow natural gas prices for the last 25 years. So you saw a big run up from 2000 to 2027. So that's back, for those that recall, during that period of time, In this country, we were running out of natural gas and we were running out of oil. And then 2008 was the recession. So we had this downturn in the supply side with the recession. At the same time, fracking related to natural gas drilling came into play, and we unleashed a lot of natural gas into the energy markets. So you can see that downward trend and really flat period of time for, over 15 years up until 2023. And then we saw a lot of volatility come into play. So for example, the war in Ukraine and the disruption that caused in the world markets. The United States is now an exporter. So our natural gas particularly is subject to the cost of natural gas across the world. Weather, there were some other weather events, but you can see that volatility has increased and that upward trend, and the blue line is power supply cost. So very volatile, and really a shift in the economics of wholesale power costs in the last 5 or 6 years. So that's on the energy side. So back, if you remember, we have the energy charge, we have transmission charge, we have capacity charge. So this relates to the energy component. So volatility, but overall not historically, not too far out of the norm. If you look at transmission, so these are the transmission rates associated with the AP transmission or service territory. And you can see that very significant increase starting in 2019 until today. So you can see it's doubled for all practical purposes since 2016. And what that is these are the investments that the investor-owned utilities and the entities that own the transmission systems are making significant investments in the transmission grid. Some of that is just original assets that were put in service a long time ago and need to be replaced. Again, if you think about our highway system, right, a lot of it went in the 1950s, and now we're at a point where there's a lot of highways that need to be redone, and same with the transmission system. So that has driven that crossed up, and then also here of recent increase in load to serve load has caused that to go up. So when we talk about capacity in PJM, which is the regional transmission organization, so they're the entity that is responsible for the reliability of power supply and transmission, everything that goes along with power supply for that footprint right there. Okay, so basically East Coast all the way, there's a small section there in northern Illinois in the Chicago area. And then each one of these colors represents a different transmission owner in that region. So the purple right here in the middle, you'll see APP, that's the APCO, that's the division of AP that's in the Virginias, and that's the RTO, or the transmission service provider that's in this part of the country. But you can see that's broken up into all these. So each one of these colors on the map has a cost associated with the transmission rate, and also has a cost associated with the capacity. So when we talk about installed capacity, PJM's primary job, as I mentioned earlier, is to keep the lights on. So they have an auction every year. It's for 3 years out. So, for example, the plant, and this gets a little bit complicated because the year is bifurcated. So the planning year starts June 1. So it goes over 2 calendar years. So we're currently we're just coming to the end of the 25-26 planning year. That was held back in 2024. So they do these auctions ahead of the actual year so that there's some certainty to know what those costs are. They hold an auction, they pay the generators, then the generators receive this as a payment, and the load pays for the cost. So it's generator gets paid, load pays for the bill. And then members, in the case here with Bedford, that have resources that sit, when I say behind their meter, it's within the community, behind the interconnection point to the transmission system. They get credit for that generation, which helps lower those capacity and transmission costs. And I'll show that here in a minute in relationship to the town's power supply. So on the capacity cost, 2017's 18 planning years is to the left. And then the last 3 auctions, you can see what the price has been. So it's almost 1,000% increase since 2024. And this, again, is fundamentally driven by the demand outstripping the supply with the resources that we have to meet the growing demand from a
Hey, Paul.
reliability standpoint.
Can I interrupt you a second? When you see that large increase in capacity cost, in our case, our capacity cost bill went from about $40,000 a month to $300,000 a month. And that was one of the major reasons why we needed a rate increase last year. The first 4 months of that rate increase, we covered as the utility. But it just became such a large amount of money that we could no longer sustain that payment without going for a rate increase. So that chart you have right there is one of the driving factors in the rate increase we had last October.
With only 8,000 accounts, electric accounts in the city, how is that sustainable?
Well, that's why we had to have an increase, to cover that additional cost.
You just don't have the revenue.
Well-
Not enough revenue.
Well, there is enough revenue, and we'll get there, but that's what drove that rate change. So. But we will take questions at the end of Paul's presentation, but I just wanted to, because this graph is very critical to what happened to us.
Did you know that was going to happen so drastically?
In that last auction period, as Paul mentioned, normally they would have a 3-year auction in advance. At that time, it got compressed to less than a year.
Less than a year.
So no, we didn't get the
We didn't have the
warning that
3
You
year.
get the heads up.
No.
Did not. And they're just now getting back to the 3-year cycle. And my only couple more comments on this is every electric ratepayer in the PJM footprint pays these costs. This isn't specific to any one of AMP's members or any, so whether you're served by an investor-owned, a cooperative, anybody that's even retail providers, these costs get passed through. The only other comment that I'll have is these 2 auctions right here, that there was a cap in place for these auctions, that they put a cap and a floor on it. So it couldn't go higher than a price. In this case, it was $333-ish. So you can see both of these auctions went clear to the cap. If the cap wasn't in place, likelihood it would have went higher. Again, because of the resource adequacy and the shortfalls that are forecasted, these are the price signals that are being given for people to build generation, is to be able to meet that load. And again, that price signal is what the primary driver behind this price is giving them the signal that generation needs to be built. So this again is the wholesale power supply cost. So this isn't the retail side. This is just the wholesale side of the town's power supply. So this is actuals through 24. So you can see the gray. So the blue is energy. The white area on top is transmission, and the gray area is capacity. So you can see 22, 23, 24, you can see the transmission. You know, actually energy prices came down during that period of time. But transmission, you can see a significant increase from 23 to 24. So part of that was the increase in transmission rates, and may have been driven by a winter peak too. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. But then as we forecast it out, and I'll just use 2027 as an example here because the math is easy. So you can see roughly 60% of the wholesale power cost is energy. Transmission is 30%, and now capacity is 10% of the wholesale power cost. Where back here, it was relatively nothing. And again, you can see energy, when we talk about energy, it's fairly stable, but it's back to the resource adequacy and the price signals in the market that there needs to be more generation in place to be able to meet the reliability to keep the lights on in the system. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit, through some nuances in the state of Virginia. So for the state is a net importer of electric power supply. So that means the state uses more energy as a whole than they generate, so they have to import. Back in 2023, based on the EIA data, it was over a third, or about 36% of this power has to be imported from the state. So what's that mean? That means the state as a whole is now dependent on the exposure to the PJM market that we just talked a little bit about, and the volatility that can occur, particularly around when there's scarcity pricing in the case of high load times, extreme weather, so these winter weather events. So the state as a whole is reliant on that power to come in from the outside. So that means transmission system has to be able to support that, to be able to get the energy in. So again, back to the investments in the transmission system. And the generation that has been developed in the state is, and I'll show that on the next slide, is not what we would call dispatchable or baseload generation that can meet those needs when they're there. It's more renewables and things like that that only generate power when the sun is shining or the wind's blowing or the water's flowing. So again, you'll see this on the next slide, but natural gas and nuclear are the main two types of generation resources that are from a reliability standpoint in the state. Coal's a very small portion of that now. And then when we talk about long-term reliability, that requires this dispatchable generation that I just talked about that's driving the capacity prices up to give that price signal to get things built, and then also transmission expansion, because if you don't have the generation near the load, you have to have the wires to get it into the load. So this is a historical generation mix for the state of Virginia going back to 2000 to 2024. The blue on the bottom is coal, so you can see that significant decline over the last 25 years. The little, whatever, brown on top of that is hydro. The big gray piece in the middle that's really expanded from about 2014 on is natural gas. So again, back to that exposure to the natural gas market, and this isn't uncommon for most of the power supply across this country. Okay, what's shown here for the resources in Virginia is pretty typical across all the states that we operate in. And then the yellow mustard color there is nuclear, so you can see that's been pretty consistent over this time period. Blue on top of that is petroleum, so again, that could be a catch-all: oil, diesel fuel, it can be a multiple. And then the darker brown on top is wind, and then the gray that really doesn't start showing up until about 2019 is solar. So you can see a tremendous amount of solar has been built out in the last few years compared to any other generation for the last 10 years. It's predominantly been solar. And then the top blue on there is biomass, wood, other types of things. So what that means is coal particularly has come off. That's a base load resource that would generate power, that generates power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Has been replaced by solar. So again, solar, as everybody can appreciate, only generates energy when the sun's shining. The rest of the time it doesn't do anything. So that's fine on the energy side. A day like today, it's very, you know, for all practical purposes, very economical energy. But from a capacity standpoint, for reliability, to keep the lights on, you can't count on that. You can't do that. So this is where we're at with, again, this is Virginia, but as I mentioned, this is not uncommon for almost all of our portfolio. And this is a little hard, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but what this is a forecast capacity, or basically resource development across the country. So this isn't just Virginia specific, this is across the country. But the blue line on the bottom, that's coal, so this starts in 2025 and goes out through 2050. You can see it's projected that more coal continues to come off into the future. And again, this is across the whole country. You can see the things in the middle are pretty flat. They're not changing. That's your nuclear, your hydro, and then a little bit that increases the blue and the yellow. Those are natural gas resources, and the green, those are all natural gas resources that we see a little bit of growth in. And then the gray one on the top is solar, renewable resources. So I mean, it shouldn't say it's all solar, but predominantly it's solar. So as you look out, and this is all information that comes from the EIA, that when it comes to, you know, developing resources, the forecast is we're going to continue to see more renewables built, and at the same time more dispatchable baseload type resources either be relatively stagnant or declining. And then I'll talk here in a second with load growth. So now we've got load growth on top of this with resources that we really can't rely on for resource adequacy. So in the case of the state of Virginia, the economic growth around data centers is really what's driving the picture here in the state. Northern Virginia remains and continues to be the largest data center market globally, and what it's doing now is it's starting to migrate away from there. We're seeing it in Ohio. We're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. There's a number of data centers that are going in that area. Seeing the same type of things in Ohio now. And what that means, it used to be you had planned growth that was, for the most part, socialized across the territory, right? It wasn't all in one area. Now it's these large data centers coming in a very specific spot, and you got to do a lot to get the power to where it needs to be because the infrastructure is so confined. So this is the AEP. This is kind of busy, but so this is the AEP service territory. So here is these are all load growth projections. So here is going back to 2000 through 2025. Oh, hit the wrong button. Sorry. Really flat. And then we start to see these lines go up. So the blue is the 2025 forecast. So that was last year. The green is 2026. You can see how much it changed in just a year. What's driving that? Data centers. That's the summer peak. This is the winter peak. So this, again, very similar trends here. This is the service territory that we're looking at. This is the AP service territory goes through the Virginias, up through Ohio, over into Michigan, southern Michigan, and northern Indiana. And then when we look at the other investor-owned utility in the state, Dominion, I mean, that's where all the data centers really focused, is in that northern Virginia area. And you can see there, it's very similar, and theirs is even steeper with that continued forecasted development of data centers. Again, and these forecasts are what then go into the modeling that then goes into the requirements for these auctions that I mentioned with capacity. So they're forecasting these high loads. At the same time, the resources are not adequate enough to meet that. So that, again, increases that clearing price for that. So when we talk about power supply planning in general, it's fundamentally, you have to maintain reliability, you've got to match the load growth with the infrastructure investment. So historically, that's what utilities do. They look at it for a long horizon, they identify those needs, and then they develop the assets, acquire the assets to meet those needs. It used to be, you know, from a traditional standpoint, we used to think 1% a year was pretty aggressive load growth. If I hop back here, see these numbers. We're 5 times that with what's in the industry right now, predominantly driven by the data centers. I've talked about this, you know, to get where we need to be, we need additional dispatchable generation resources. We need those transmission upgrades. Again, these are all put upward pressure on these costs. When we think about how we balance this out, right, and think about affordability, reliability, sustainability, these are all things that we put into our power supply planning for our members. Resource adequacy, the other challenge we're up against is, you know, there was a number of policies that were put in place the last 10 to 15 years that have caused some of this generation to be retired. Also, the complexity of interconnecting all of these resources into the grid. There's a process that has to go through that can take 3 to 5 years. So, for example, if you were to build a natural gas combined cycle plant today, you would be very lucky to get it built and online in 7 years. Some of that's supply chain issues, you know, to get the equipment and things like that. The other part is just the regulatory aspect you have to go through. So there's just a number of things that have converged in the market that are driving these wholesale prices up, and ultimately then customers pay this. You know, one example here in the state of Virginia, again, from a policy standpoint, is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. The state's rejoining that in July. That has, you know, an impact on carbon generating resources in the state of Virginia. So just another, you know, another aspect for cost related to energy on resources within the state, and also, you know, a regulatory challenge for somebody that may want to build that type of resource in the state. So we talk about the town's power supply. Here's Bedford's power supply portfolio. So again, starting at the top and going clockwise, the hydros, these are all local hydros, the solar, these are all renewable assets that are located here in the community. And then we've got it's labeled 2025 monthly. Those are power purchases or contract purchases for, we do things monthly depending on season, winter, fall, summer. And then net market, so about 2.5% of it is in the market. And then SEPA is, that's another hydro resource federally allocated to Virginia members. And then we have the AMP Fremont Energy Center. The acronym there is AFET. That's the red. That's the combined cycle plant. So about a little over 25% of the town's power supply comes from that resource. And then Prairie State, which is the Mine Mouth coal plant that I mentioned earlier, about a third of the power supply. And then Locust Wind, this is 2025. So the Locust Wind, actually, that project contract ended last fall. So, but the Blue Creek is another wind resource. So very diversified portfolio, and you know, when you think about energy portfolio, it's much like you would think about an investment portfolio. You want to be diversified across a number of different types of resources, so that you're not exposed to any one type of resource or fuel costs, etc. So in summary, again, well-balanced, diverse portfolio, ownership of these varying types of generation assets, hedge the risk against fuel prices, volatility around that, energy, capacity markets. So as owning a resource or through AMP, Bedford, their allocation of those resources is like an ownership position. They get credit through that power supply. They get credit for those capacities. So as I mentioned, PJM pays the generators the capacity, the amount for the capacity. So that's reflected in the rates associated with these projects. Prairie State specifically, again, that's a coal resource, and it provides energy, low cost, stable, and you know, from a capacity standpoint, it brings a lot of value. Same with the Fremont Energy Center. That one's a little bit different. It's a natural gas resource, so it's referred to as dispatchable. So if the market, as long as its costs are less than the market, then we don't run it. The costs are the market is more than the cost, and we run it. So again, it's a hedge against the energy market, but you also get the capacity value as well. The multiple renewable resources promote low-cost energy. Again, solar is very low-cost energy, and sustainability. And then power purchase agreements, so those slices along that provides flexibility as load or the market conditions change, so you're not locked into a resource there. Those come and go depending on the term. And then the behind-the-meter resources, which are providing a tremendous amount of value now in today's capacity, with today's capacity costs, are a real asset to the community. And those are the peaking generators and the other resources that are located here in the community. And with that concludes my my presentation. So John,
Let me just say that we have, as Paul mentioned, a diverse portfolio of energy supply. For us, in our situation, and this territory is generally winter peaking. And for example, this last July and February, we had about 3 weeks of weather where we did not go above freezing. And that's when we peak, and that's when AEP, Appalachian Power Peak, and that established our transmission costs for the next year. So what we do with our behind-the-meter resources is we try and run them to decrease that allocation. Unfortunately, at that time it was so cold that the water froze on the James River, and our hydro plant did not produce what we had hoped because it was frozen. We also peak in the wintertime, the hour ending 8 a.m. generally. Unfortunately, the sun does not really come up, and it's not really producing any solar energy. So the whole renewable side, we're a big supporter of that field of renewables. They do produce generally low-cost energy, but they don't really produce any capacity. So that's another reason why we are vulnerable to those capacity charges. So I can assure you that we're working diligently to continue to reduce the cost as best we can. All the tools we have in our toolbox to do that. The main ones behind the meter generation. We're looking at siting more solar facilities here in town. And that's where we get the biggest bang for the buck. As you know, we also, just on at the last council meeting, we went ahead with the purchase of an additional combined cycle gas unit in Northern Virginia. We are seeing growth here locally. With the amount of residential development we're seeing, we could have 500 to 1,000 new homes here in Bedford in 2 years, which is a tremendous amount of growth for us. Our demand has actually been declining. You know, we lost Winona, the steel plant here in town. We lost some of our big customers. So our demand has been declining for several years. But now, with all this residential organic load growth, we're going to see a big spurt in usage. So,
John, the lady up front asked a question, if this was predictable, and she didn't get an answer, so I will reiterate the question. Were my neighbors' bills doubling and tripling predictable? And if so, why weren't they given a heads up like halfway through the month? Hey, I know you only spent $200 last month. This month we want $600. Behind the meter.
That's what he said.
yeah.
That's the question. This man gave a fantastic briefing, but he didn't answer the question of why is it so expensive?
And they've been able to predict it well for the last 50 years. I put it down.
In our case, let me just answer. In our case, it was solely dependent on the weather. So how the weather then predict the weather, with what accuracy? At the beginning of January, we didn't know we were going to have 3 weeks below.
This isn't the first time we've had bad weather.
No, it isn't, but you have to look at how it's concentrated for 3 weeks straight. Yes, we've had cold days.
And
And we did during Hurricane Elliott several years ago, we had a cold weekend.
So is this gonna happen in the summer when we get a week straight, 2 weeks straight of high
We're not
temperatures?
nearly as vulnerable in the summertime because, first of all, the demand comes later in the day, and that happens on a sunny day when our solar is generating more energy. So, no, we're not
My
nearly
air
as,
conditioner is going to cost me $1,000.
well, it's going to depend on your usage, of course, but
Well,
we're
does
not
the
nearly as
technology,
vulnerable in the
Let him answer the
summer.
question before you ask another question.
We're not nearly as vulnerable in the summertime as we are in the winter. Because Appalachian Power, is our transmission provider, they generally are not peaking in
they're
the
on
summer.
50 days.
Let him answer it, and then you can ask your question. That's all I'm saying.
So, to answer your question, we're not nearly as vulnerable in the summer as we are in the winter. However, if you do get hot weather and you're gonna run your air conditioner, it's gonna result in a higher bill.
You were talking about development, the future development of the different residential units coming into play here. How much of the developers themselves that are installing these new residences or these new communities in Bedford? We had to supply that power to those homes, correct?
We do supply the power, but they pay for the infrastructure to get it in the
Okay.
development. So,
And then the residents themselves pay the hookup fee, is that
we
correct?
don't have a hookup fee like a water utility does,
Okay.
because generally the developer has paid most of that infrastructure.
So do you feel that with the new residents coming into town to expand the revenue, that we'll be in a better position to spread the wealth, so to speak?
Yeah, obviously, if we're getting 1,000 new homes in the next few years, we have 8,000 customers, it's gonna give us a larger base to spread costs.
And the trickle-down effect from NOVA, from Northern Virginia, what percentage of that are the data centers covering? Because it's all going on nationally. Everybody's feeling the pressure off the data centers.
And you have to pay the same.
But how much percentage are they covering
So there's,
of what you were talking about, the infrastructure?
they're paying their share based on their load. So they're not
It's
paying,
not the same per kilowatt that I have to pay, it's more.
No, it's less.
It's
well,
less, and they get kickbacks, so I should start a data center here, basically.
well, yeah, so there's, yeah, so when it comes to, again, what I went through on a wholesale power supply side of things, all customers at the wholesale level pay those costs. So they pay their proportionate share. Now, again, these costs get socialized, so transmission costs, if the transmission costs are getting built, physically they're being built in that area, right, those costs get socialized across the entire, in this case, AEP or Dominion footprint.
Across the whole service area?
Yeah. And
From
then,
each area of data center, how far is that gonna go? Like Nova is coming all down here, we got Botetourt getting ready to go. We are within 30 miles from Botetourt, so we're gonna feel that too, when that opens up.
Yeah, what she's talking about is that it's talking about county.
So next door neighbors.
2,000.
so if I,
megawatt data center.
I'm just gonna use this as a point of reference. So you see how these forecasted costs level out up here?
Right.
That's because of data centers. Because the way these costs are calculated, it's their total investment in their transmission system divided by their total load. So as their load goes up, the cost for the transmission rate comes down. So even though they may be spending more money than they did in these years, that cost on a per unit basis comes down because there's more load. Back to the John's, with the potential development with residential, you got more customers, you've got more megawatts, megawatt hours, kilowatt
I
hours, but
think
it
too,
costs over.
for this town of Bedford, it's hard for us to fathom that we're a community of a median income of approximately, $35,000, $40,000. We can't compete with Nova, where the median income is $150,000, $180,000. So we're wondering how that's why it's so hard for these residents here. We're just not in that bracket. So it's very, very difficult. We have a lot of senior citizens and whatnot, and it's difficult.
Yeah, I understand that, and I agree with you. As that one chart that Paul showed, where the capacity cost went up so steeply in the short term, that's really the result of many years of regulation that have diminished the supply while the demand has gone up.
Right.
And that is one thing that has driven that price up, because all of a sudden, PJM, which is a regional grid operator, said, oh my God, we're going to be short. We're going to have blackouts. We don't want that. So they push the price up to get people to invest in generation. The question we have to ask, is it working? And as Paul pointed out, really practically to get a new gas unit online is probably 10 years. Could be a little bit shorter. So this is really in place to get people to invest money in regeneration, which is what we need. However, people are not rushing to invest that money because they don't know if they can collect it over the life of the asset.
If the price goes back down to the other side, then that becomes very tough to make the economics work. So.
Can you talk briefly about the pros and cons of mandating that data centers provide their own electricity that they generate on site and don't impact the grid? I mean, that would lower the demand, but also lower the customer base. So can you give some sort of discussion of that?
Sure. So that's definitely a topic, particularly with the explosion of the data center growth across the country. That is one option that data centers are looking at, not necessarily from a cost standpoint, but so they can get their data centers up and running when they need them to. Because right now, they may need to have transmission built to get to serve these. That may take 3 or 4 years. They want to get them going sooner. So there's in that situation, if a data center were to build their own generation, then those costs they're being served by that power plant that's located there, and that's their cost. Long term, you know, again, from a reliability standpoint, data centers typically want really high reliability, so they're going to want to be interconnected to the grid to get power in case that power plant doesn't run or something happens and it comes offline. There's where the economics in these wholesale, now it becomes a resource that's got to be supplied off of the transmission system, which go back to these costs. So there's a number of states that I know are looking at different options, communities, cost sharing when it comes to particularly around infrastructures with data centers. But I think the long term with this is it wouldn't be a practical business decision for those data centers to just be on an island with just their own generation. Ultimately, they're going to be interconnected to the transmission system.
And if they did, then they would be part of the.
Yeah, so then their plant.
Purchase power, which would drive up all the purchase power.
Well, you know, so what would happen is if they build a power plant, then that power plant would then become part of the grid as well. So now we're getting assets built that we need to have built, and it would become part of the power supply portfolio for the entire grid. If they would build a power plant today to run their data center, and then ultimately when they had the transmission lines, the system interconnected to their data center facility, that power plant could become part of the transmission or the grid, where now it becomes a resource that everybody has as part of as far as the energy market goes. So it's kind of a chicken or egg thing, right? Historically, utilities have always focused on building infrastructure. You always have to build it to meet growth, because again, they're large capital investments, and you typically grow into them a little bit, right? So data centers don't want to wait for that. They want to get these things up and going. They can build the power plants.
At our expense.
Well, again, that's a political topic in a number of states. I do know. I'm not familiar
I'd
with
like to bring
that.
this back to a local discussion.
Sure.
If you could, this background is super helpful just to understand what's driving this. But then the question is, what can we do here in Bedford? How can the Bedford Municipal Co-op help people who are suddenly stuck with these bills? And people often say, my bill doubled or it tripled. But what you really need to look at is what the rate you're paying and then the amount you're using. And the rate we're paying right now is 15.38 cents per kilowatt hour. The national average is 15 cents. In Bedford County, I think it's 16 cents. In Lynchburg, I think it's 17. We are right there. We are paying, as far as the rate goes, that's the rate. That's the rate. Then the other side of that, of course, is your usage. And in December and January, we had a perfect storm. December has the shortest day of the year. Why is that important? Because the shorter the day, the more electricity you're using. Your lights are on longer, your TV's on longer. We're using energy, as Mr. Wagner said, when we don't have access to renewables because the sun isn't up yet, or it's gone to bed already, and we're still up. And a lot of people in the town of Bedford are on heat pumps, and heat pumps are not nearly as efficient below freezing. And so when we got those 3 weeks of not going above freezing, and frankly being at 20 degrees practically for 3 weeks straight, your heat pump effectively switched to full-on electric, and that's like putting a space heater in every single one of your rooms. And that's going to cost you $100 a month to run a space heater like that, because it draws a tremendous amount of electricity. So that confluence is why suddenly we have these high bills. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Well, emergency heat is
Emergency
great
heat's
on
gonna
electric.
really get you.
But exactly, but then the question is, how can we as homeowners and as bill payers and as users we have to have heat, people can't not have heat. How can we manage this in our personal budgets, in the town budget, et cetera? So there are things that people can do, and I would hope the town can expand on this. If we can go to monthly budget pricing, where you take an average of your bills for the entire year, you pay that every single month. So So instead of paying $800 in January, maybe you pay $400, and you also pay $400 in April, when your bill might have only been $200. And at the end of the year, you reconcile, so that that's all covered. So that's something that I know the town will do, but
You offer that, and I think it'd be
Yeah,
offer, but it's something that could be done more, and that would help people with their budgeting. In
It would
terms
help
of-
with budgeting if they send me an email or call me and say, hey, Mr. Burke, I know you only used $300 in electricity last month, but it's only midway through the month, you're already at $300. You might want to come look at your heat pump or something like that. A tickler system instead of surprising me with a double bill.
Brandon brought that up.
You can't do that if you read the meter.
I was gonna say.
That's true. I mean, you can talk about the temperature. Say the temperature's cold, they're probably going to use more. But one thing we found here in Bedford County, and I love our customers, but they're very private people. And they don't often want to give us much information. They don't want to give us an email address. So it doesn't really help to do that. I understand what you're saying.
So, one of the programs y'all talked about was, demand response, deep shaving. I know we haven't done that here in town, previously. Is that something that?
No, we do that.
Is it robust enough to, I mean?
Well, let me just say, what are we doing to help with this in the future? There are three main things we're doing. Number one is we're studying the expansion of the hydro plant. You give us more hydro. In addition to that, we are studying the possibility of putting solar panels up along the river on our property. And that's one thing. We are also studying the possibility of locating solar facilities on two closed landfills here in town. And the third thing is we're working with AMP actually to add more peaking generation down on Street for our peaking generators on down. So they're studying that, and they'll get back to us with a proposal.
Right.
The demand response, though, could that be something that you reach out to customers during those demand periods?
We can make them aware through maybe a Facebook post or something like that. But as this lady so accurately pointed out, it's heat. So it's a question of, are you willing to turn your thermostat down? That's what it's doing. So, but I gotta say one thing. I want to hire this lady because she gave a great explanation of exactly what happened.
Could you explain the recovery?
I'm sorry. So you said, supply has been down. Supply has gone down is what you said.
Correct.
But on your, graph, you're making more power than ever. And then you guys also said that any additional power infrastructure will take 3 to 7 years to implement. So my question is, with the data centers growing every single year, with those 200 odd houses being put up behind the James, Bank of James, with all of that, how badly is that going to impact us until 7 years from now, when this infrastructure can be put up to actually support the infrastructure that's being put up this year?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't give you a real good answer. Other than here in Bedford, in our service territory, we are weather dependent. So there for several years, we had mild winters. And our rates actually went down. But once we started getting more harsh winters and colder temperatures, that pushed our costs up. So let's, we are, just keep in mind that we are very weather driven, especially in the winter. Because we don't have natural gas here in Bedford. Now, some people have wood heat, some people have propane, but not, our density of electric heat is probably 98%. And people need heat, as this lady said. And it's very difficult on those very cold days, which are the highest cost day for us, to conserve.
Sure, and that's fine, and I know that everyone I know does their best to turn the heat down, not run it so high in the winter. But if I'm already paying $650 a month this winter, am I going to be paying $900 a month next winter until this infrastructure is put in place?
No, I don't think
first year I exceeded, well, I'm on a budget plan, it works very well, thank you. But how are you gonna plan for that? If I'm $196 in the rears, and my budget plan gonna go up, where you gonna say, oh no, February was a food month? How are y'all gonna plan for that?
We're too smart, guys. The really smart person is that. Cheryl, she's a genius, and she can explain that.
It's a 12-month average, so it will go into your calculation for the next budget cycle.
How many average?
It's a 12-month, we do add a 1-month buffer to try to give you a little bit of room in case we have a bad winter. But our system actually calculates that, and we run a budget calculation, and it runs your 12-month average plus 1 month.
I'd like to know how you calculate your recovery.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Yes.
I have a $37 usage kilowatts, $37, but my bill is $209.
That's right.
I understand that. And what happened in the
And
background?
how long is that gonna last?
In the background, while all this was happening with costs, and we redesigned our bill. We used to have a DCA charge, and then we had an energy charge. What happened is we combined those two things and now call it a recovery charge. And then the other part of the bill was just sort of base rates, which is the infrastructure charge. So that recovery charge is the generation cost and the delivery cost. It's the generation cost we pay for AMP, the generation cost we incur locally, and the transmission cost we pay APCO. Right now, one of the biggest components of our bill is our APCO transmission charge. It's $500,000 a month. That one charge. And then our capacity charge is another $300-some thousand. So our fixed cost every month is almost $1 million. That's before we use 1 kilowatt hour.
So you can't calculate that recovery.
Well, what we did on the past is we do a 6-month average. And we did that to give kind of a levelized charge. But we do it again for 6 months to see did we recover enough or did we not recover enough. If we did recover enough, we increase the charge. If we recover too much, we decrease the charge. So that's the way it works. But we don't know, we're going to know shortly that they're calculating it right now. But I do know that we under-recovered in January.
How long do those solar panels last? And what do you do with them when they're
Well, that's another good question. Our contract for our solar farm here in Bedford, which is in town, on Draper Road, is when we, as part of that deal, we stipulated they put a recovery fund together, so when it comes time to decommission the funding, they have money to remove everything as well. Now, what happens to the panels? They say that there's precious metals in there, and they can recycle it. I don't know.
It seems to look like in China it's doing this.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
Yes, sir.
During these cold snaps, would it be possible to fire up some backup generators around town?
We do.
You know, some kind of.
Well, the EPA and DEQ will not let us use backup generators. We used to run a generator down at the sewer treatment plant, and we used to run a generator at the courthouse, and one here.
One of the back ones.
But we're not permitted to do that anymore because they don't meet clean air standards for that time of use. They're okay for emergency use, but not okay for PPA. I just want to impress upon everybody that we work really hard to minimize the cost that we have to pay, and therefore keep the rates as low as possible for our customers. We love our customers. That's just, we are kind of at the end of the line. And one thing that Paul mentioned is we do participate in regulatory proceedings constantly. And you can tell me more, but in DJM, there are so many procedures going on. That AMP has a full-time staff. I don't have people that do nothing but go to DJM meetings and try and influence what decision-making they're doing, which impacts them. That's one of the benefits of being part of AMP. We could never do that with the town of Bedford. but being part of AMP, we do have much more sway. We can use that term with PJM. And we also have lobbyists here in Virginia, which are through AMP, which try to influence regulation as much as they can to benefit us. So we're trying, believe me, we're trying as hard as we can to keep the cost as low as possible for us.
How much of the power of our power bill is actually generated in Bedford typically?
We, on an annual basis, generate between 10 and 20% of our energy. It just depends on the river, depends on the,
How long has that been the case?
it's been for a while. The solar facility came online about 7 years ago. We've always had the hydro plant.
Right.
And so we get about 20% of our energy in the locally.
What was that 10 years ago?
It was probably at that.
Only 5%?
No, we're probably between 5 and 10%. Again, it depends on James River for us. Our hydro plant is.
So have we been dealing with this company, AMP, this operation, for 5 years, 10
No,
years, 20 years?
20 years.
20 years. So without AMP, we would not have access to the newer technologies like the combined cycle units.
I guess I wonder at what point, if we're only generating 5 to 10% of the actual power,
No,
that
it would
would
have
mean
10 to 20% now.
10, even 10 to 20, is it worth being in that business?
Absolutely.
Good question.
Because the hydro power that we get from Snowden works out to be, I hate to say it, almost free. Because we get capacity credit, that's all measured, and transmission credits that offset the operating cost of the plant. So the energy, the net cost of the energy produced there is almost free. So absolutely, we have that's the lowest cost energy we can get. Same thing is the case with the solar facility. The credits we get there offset the bill that we pay for that, for the most part.
John, is there anybody who competes with AMP for similar services?
Sorry?
Is there a competition for AMP? Is there any other private company that does what they do?
No, not really. I mean, the option would be for us to do the things that AMP does, or we could go out and contract with different people to do parts of it, but there's nobody that's aggregating load the way AMP does. And that gives us access to a huge economy of scale. We're doing things with AMP that we could never do as a town of Bedford.
Would more combustion turbines in the immediate area be a viable way to look at peak shaving?
Well, yeah, we use diesel generators because they're the lowest cost option. We are got the quickest turnaround to get into place. And we're very experienced with those units. So that's what we're looking at. Gas, we don't have gas. So gas turbine is not an option. No gas in Bedford County, zero. So we have to run on propane, and that would just be very
Fuel oil maybe?
Well, yeah, but when you get into those things, then you gotta worry about DEQ air quality standards. So, the diesel units we can make work. Yes, ma'am.
I need to know the solar infrastructure that you're planning on, that you already have, does that power stay here?
Yes.
Okay, because other places, like used to live in Utah, the power that they made, the solar power there, went to LA and Vegas.
No,
They didn't get to keep it.
that stays right here.
Okay, and as the one that you're going to build, is it going to stay here also?
Yes.
In reference to solar power, if I put solar panels on my roof and I generate more electricity than I use, so I have LED lights all over the place, does Bedford buy it back?
No, let me just explain that. If we bought that energy back and essentially at the retail rate, which is 15 cents per watt hour, I can buy it in the market for 5 cents. So that difference, everybody else is paying. But we do recommend, if you read our interconnection agreement for solar, that you get a battery and store your energy yourself, use it when you need it. There are all sorts of battery options out there. Tesla makes what they call Powerball and all that. So we recommend to anybody that's putting in solar that you get batteries and you keep your energy.
So how does AEP buy it back from their customers without taking the
Because
heat?
they're not half a million customers, they can afford to lose some money. We can't.
What if you were not buying it back at market rate?
Well, that, if we would do something more complex, we would require specific special metering. Right now, we're using a standard meter for our solar customers. If we got into something more complex, we'd have to install more sophisticated meters. And right now, we just can't support that. Maybe sometime in the future we can do it. The last quote we had, actually from AMP, put in more sophisticated meter, was over $200, which to us is a lot. So maybe sometime in the future we would do that.
So AEP buys it back from their customers at retail?
Yeah, they do, but they're advocating a position that they only pay a market price for it. And as you can imagine, people already in that program, they're not going to like that because it's reducing the amount that they get in credits.
Could you tell us the lifespan on this note? I know last year you were telling us at the council meeting that the river had gotten so low, you had to make some changes.
Yeah.
Do we have a lifespan on that unit up there, or I know Lynchburg has gone over to a small mobile nuclear unit in the James River?
Yeah, I don't know about that, but yeah, we did a life extension of that plant. So it's been, it originally was there and
Wow.
it was part of the canal system on the James River. So our facility is built on what was a lock in the canal.
Right.
So it went commercial in 1911, 1910. So we've been operating that plant continuously since then. 1985, they said, okay, we're going to retire the old plant, and they built an entirely new plant on the site. That's the one we operate today. So
How's it going?
it's going well. We're very fortunate. We have a supervisor there who is a perfectionist. And every time we have to get regular inspections by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for safety purposes, every time we get an inspector in that plant, they say, my God, this is the cleanest plant we go to.
Is there a concern about the water because of the climate, the heat now?
I don't know. I haven't studied it enough. All I know is that when you do get quite a bit of time, when there's hardly any water in the river, then we can't run our plant. I haven't studied over, one period of time of the water flows.
Thank you.
But, yeah, it's really important. So we're looking at repowering the old plant with small generators that can run the less water. Well, hey, this is great. No more questions. But I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to minimize our costs. We are sympathetic to everybody. I know, Ann, we work with people every day that do payment arrangements and all that. So, if you have questions or issues, please go to the finance department and the treasurer's office. They will be happy to do whatever they possibly can.
Thank you. Thank you.